Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Sarah Krisky. I am the project manager here at the Rosa-Luxemburg-Stiftung Geneva office, working on international trade union politics and just transition strategies. I'm filling in today for our office director, Jan Leidecker, who unfortunately got caught up in the travel mayhem that is currently seemingly ongoing at a global level. So he could not join us today. I'll be filling in and moderating. I'll first very briefly present kind of the RLS and our work here in Geneva, and then introduce the two speakers, and then we'll get into the discussion. First of all, welcome. This is kind of a first type of office webinar that we're planning to have more of here in Geneva, where we will talk more about sort of the work that we're doing. Today we're presenting a report. In general, we have, different events and research that is kind of ongoing. So maybe a few words first about the Rosa-Luxemburg Foundation. We are one of the 6 major German political foundations, tasked primarily with conducting political education in Germany and abroad. Associated with the Left Party, we're a democratic socialist organization committed to left politics. And in Geneva here, we work thematically on global social rights, global health, just transition strategies, and other thematics, seeking to connect United Nations institutions, as well as other Geneva-based international organizations, with partners from the Global South in particular. So we believe that the multilateral systems such as the UN Human Rights Council, which is currently meeting right now, World Health Organization, or the International Labour Organization, which just finished their conference, are important sites of advocacy and action for the left, but at the same time that these systems have to be interrogated critically. So with this in mind, one of our core areas of interest is the actual operation of these systems and their workings on the inside, as well as working kind of within them, what that means. Just today, I think, or this week, the BBC came out with an internal investigation of a kind of UN whistleblower system. And there's quite a few allegations there of quite serious abuses, and the former spokeswoman on harassment, assault, and discrimination, Purna Sen, said, and I quote, "There's a real tension within an organization which not only upholds and advocates for human rights, but is actually the birthplace of most of these human rights, yet it hasn't learned to bring them home to the people who work for that organization." So I thought it was quite timely that this has been happening, because here, of course, in the RLS, we believe that international solidarity is the key to the socio-ecological transformation that we need, and to implement social rights on a global scale, within which a revitalized UN could play a decisive role, but to do so, it must be also part of the transformation and transform itself. So what does that mean exactly? Well, here we are talking specifically about the experience of trans, non-binary, and gender non-conforming workers in international Geneva, within and outside of the UN system. So we recently released a report, a qualitative report based on anonymized interviews that was conducted by our first speaker today, Dr. Mira Fay. So I'll introduce the two speakers now. So Dr. Mira Fay, pronounced she, they, originally from Germany, is a postdoctoral fellow and lecturer at Haute École de Travail Social de Genève, so Graduate Institute of Social Work, Geneva. She's the lead investigator of the research project TransVis, Visibility Without Protection, interrogating the effects of visibility on trans participation in the city. Between 2019 and 2021, she was working on the project Dementia Diagnostic Between Cure and Care, Policies, Practices, and Ethical Issues in the Swiss Cantons, managed by Professor Barbara Lucas. She defended her PhD dissertation, Serve and Protect Also Those at the Margins, 3 essays on police, prostitution, and policy at the Graduate Institute of Geneva in November 2019. And of course, as we know, the UN is a global organization with centers in different parts of the world. And I'm very happy also to welcome Sahar Moazzami, pronounced they, them, UN program officer, at Outright Action International, to provide the perspective from New York, which we're looking forward to hearing. Sahar is a New York bar admitted attorney with a focus on international human rights law. They have successfully led campaigns to push for more inclusive language within official UN documents, including a resolution on extrajudicial executions and more recently a resolution on strengthening elections. Sahar works to create a more inclusive women, peace and security agenda, focusing on queering the Security Council as outright representative within the NGO working group on women, peace and security. And they also work to make global South activists more visible in the UN and co-lead several CSO coalitions, including the Women's Rights Caucus and the LGBTI Caucus at the Commission on the Status of Women. Sahar holds a JD from Fordham Law School and a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from Boston University. So I am partial already. I've been talking for way too long. So I want to actually give the floor to our speakers now. So Mira, maybe you can first present the report, you know, the logics behind it, kind of the findings that you came up with. And then we'll move on to a reaction from Sahar, and then we'll open it up to the audience who can, of course, use the Q&A function for any questions that you might have. So please, Mira, go ahead. The floor is yours.
Thanks so much. Yeah, thank you so much, Steva, for this introduction. Yeah, so I'm very happy to be here today, present this report, and also hear more from you, Sahar, about your reactions and overall the work you're doing. Because I didn't, obviously, because it was focused on Geneva, I didn't really talk with anyone from Outright Action International because that's more like focus on New York. So I think it would be very interesting to hear what your perspective is on this as well. I ended up for the report, as I will mention in a bit, talking to some people who are not necessarily based in Geneva, but the normal focus was on Geneva. Yeah, so how did this study come into being? Basically, the idea behind it that Seva and I worked on together to come up with a report was that externally, some UN bodies, of course not all, and entities started, let's say in the early 2000s, to focus more on the various forms of discrimination and violence faced by people based on their sexual orientation, and then also with some delay, gender identity, the expression and sexual characteristics. So I'll be using the acronym SOGIESC for that. There have been some joint statements by UN member states, as well as the Human Rights Council on this, highlighting violence and discrimination against LGBTQIA+ people. In 2016, for instance, the UN Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights also created the mandate of the independent expert on sexual orientation and gender identity, so the i.e. SOGI. Yeah, so there is a increased focus on SOGIESC issues in UN programming and also in resolutions. However, as has also been pointed out repeatedly by UN Globe, the internal employment situation is still not really up to date and is still lagging when it comes to comparing it, for instance, to corporations, but also to the public sector, depending on where, of course. Especially trans, non-binary and gender non-conforming employees are disadvantaged compared to cis workers and continue to struggle with administrative, protocol, and human resource related issues, also safety and security related challenges, health related matters, and concerns, for instance, linked to the absence of gender neutral bathrooms. So this is kind of the starting point of this report. We wanted to look at the divergence between official statements that demand an end of discrimination based on SOGIESC, and on the other hand, the internal everyday employment situation faced by trans, non-binary and gender non-conforming workers. Because it's a little bit contradictory when you are advocating for something on the outside, but on the inside, gender diverse people actually don't feel really safe to work for your organization. Yeah, so basically, to do this study, to talk to people, we, together with UN Globe, developed a call for participation. that was shared throughout Geneva to reach out to UN entities and other international organizations. I also then contacted different people individually, and also contacted various LGBT focal points and UN Globe Agency coordinators. This all happened in February and March. Yeah, I sent out really quite a lot of emails. And in the end, I was able to conduct 19 interviews with 23 individuals in total, 10 of which were with LGBT focal points, UN Globe representatives, and also diversity and inclusion and human resource personnel. So those were, to the large majority, not trans, non-binary, gender diverse, but instead cis workers. Majority of them were actually also queer in some way, some of them not, but they then kind of identified as allies. Yes, but also with the call for participation, we targeted directly people who are trans, non-binary and or gender non-conforming within International Geneva. And there I was able to conduct 9 interviews with individuals working within Geneva. Yeah, so with these 19 interviews, I then used qualitative content analysis to code them, to identify common themes and categories, and the report basically reflects those. One of the goals for me was, and generally is in research, to not try to speak for people, but also use research to give a platform to people. So when you read the report, you will see that there are quite a lot of quotes, and also some of them are quite long, but I found it important to actually use the words of the participants that talk to me themselves instead of trying to paraphrase, because I just think sometimes it's a lot more powerful to hear from them directly than through my voice. But of course, I grouped them among the common themes to highlight what the most important or most common issues were that were mentioned. So to mention a few of those, 3 key topics emerged basically that hinder the work and hinder a positive, overall fully positive work-life experience. And these are substantive knowledge gaps regarding gender identity and expression, and also overall SOGIESC topics, which then lead to microaggressions and invisibilization. For instance, when people don't even understand what being trans or non-binary means, and they might not be aware that the person opposite of them is trans or non-binary, they might misgender them, they might use a wrong name or title, and overall also, just as I mentioned in the report, share stories about their experience with, for instance, trans and non-binary people that are quite unpleasant. At the same time, missing knowledge can also lead to non-acceptance. So those are key issues that are then also linked to the second key theme, which are outdated forms, badges, and titles. So overall, the UN system and also other international organizations in Geneva are very bureaucratic and very, very old school in a way. And all employment forms, largely, I mean, there are some exceptions, but most employment forms are still binary. And if you are trans, you have to kind of prove your gender and name through providing the passport. So if you are coming from a country where a change is not permitted, this is impossible. At the same time, this then also affects, for instance, the badge that is printed for you, which might have the name you were given at birth, so your dead name. And you have to use this badge every day. So that's already, I find, quite a violation in itself. At the same time, a lot of the people I talked to said that the security personnel at least never gave them any issue. So even if there was a name that didn't necessarily align well with their gender expression, they never said anything. And yeah, so that was at least something positive. But at the same time, this should not be the norm that they are relying on benevolent security personnel. Overall, changing name and gender within the system is hugely problematic in administrative terms. The IT system is also still quite binary. And then also one issue that was mentioned by the people who are working for HR and other places that are not trans, non-binary, or gender non-conforming was that data security can't be guaranteed. So it might be that the disconnect between your passport and, for instance, the name that you're currently using might be open to access for some people. So then they underline that the data protection of the person should be prioritized, which of course makes a lot of sense. But at the same time, this was not something that was a concern for the trans, non-binary, and gender non-conforming people I talked to. Of course, it's also important to notice that most of them did not come from countries where it would be hugely problematic to be trans or non-binary. Yeah, and then the third issue that was mentioned by most of the people as well is the lack of gender-neutral bathrooms. So this is, of course, something that is very common, I think, in many workplaces. There are only gendered toilets, and especially for non-binary people or gender non-conforming people, this creates a huge problem. But also for trans people who identify as one of the binary genders, so to speak. For them, it was also problematic in the process of their transition, and they also received bad looks, but also some comments. And yeah, overall, it can be very uncomfortable to not have a bathroom where you feel safe, where you feel harassed. And yeah, especially for non-binary people then where you don't feel welcome at all. I mean, there's not even a bathroom to go to when the work environment overall is already quite hostile to your gender identity. So these three aspects, so substantive knowledge gaps, outdated forms, badges and titles, and the lack of gender neutral bathrooms are the key issues. Of course, then there are some other obstacles that are mentioned. For instance, a lot of the participants also were afraid of harming their career when being too vocal about their gender identity. This was not the case for all of them. So yeah. And the other issues that also, especially non-binary people, felt quite invisible, and their knowledge is even missing much more than when it comes to trans people. So yeah, this was definitely another issue. And then it's the question where the burden falls on information and training. Yeah, so that's kind of it on the main obstacles. The report then also, I don't know, how am I on time? Should I continue a bit on some of the strategies?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, go ahead, maybe in 5 minutes. Yeah.
So yeah, I then also kind of pushed the topic of which strategies were mentioned to change some of these issues or overall to raise awareness on SOGIESC, and also what kind of could be mentioned as explaining the slow progress or the lack of progress really. Here, one issue one suggestion really that is mentioned by a number of people was supportive leadership. So yeah, the heads of the different UN bodies or other organizations should really express their support for SOGIESC people. This is seen as vital and also underlined by some of the people as having made a big difference. So showing support is very important, and also shows that gender diverse people are not alone. also potentially progressive member states that support SOGIESC policies should put pressure for change. A second huge issue, of course, is then to develop specialized trainings, to provide specialized trainings, but develop them by experts who actually know what they're talking about, because sometimes the burden falls on HR personnel or DEI personnel who might not actually be trained, or might not, if they are not themselves queer, might lack the knowledge, and they're surely trying their best. I'm not saying that they're not, but they might just not know enough about the topic. And this then leads to a lot of issues when wrong terms are used, when, again, people are invisibilized and not mentioned, and also when, for instance, gender is conflated with women, for instance, that is still the case in many of the UN agencies, and not the topic of gender identities, they're not at all mentioned. Yeah, so I think having experts develop trainings is a huge, would be a huge advantage, and also trainings that go beyond one of the entities or bodies, but also are kind of universal for the organization as a whole. Because otherwise, again, you have one training here, another training there, and the knowledge is not really the same. And you can't rely that everyone knows the same. So, of course, that's a big issue. Just for those who are interested, there are in total 15 recommendations in the report. I have mentioned some core ones now, but overall, you find them at the end of the report, and they also pertain to, for instance, medical and health related issues, because also there are huge gaps still, and also recruitment and also post-related recommendations. And apart from that, of course, some of the ones I already mentioned are linked to name, gender marker and pronouns, and also HR and data related. Overall, I'm quite happy with the report. I'm quite happy with it so far. And I just want to say, in finishing this presentation, I'm again super grateful to all the people who talked to me and opened up to me, and especially, of course, the transgender non-conforming people, and also the others who are working really hard on changing the situation from within, but against a huge opposition from member states that might not be very open to SOGIESC rights, and also against just a huge bureaucratic system that is very hard to change from within, as we know also when it comes to other topics. Yeah, thanks so much.
Yes, thank you very much. That's, it's a strange feeling to say, like, I'm also very happy with this report, that we've done this and we have kind of pursued this line of questioning, but of course the findings are, leave you kind of in a place where we're trying to understand, okay, where do we go from here, and what can be done then further on. But hopefully we'll have some questions from the audience, so that of course I have a lot, but maybe I shouldn't take up too much space. So let's then go to Sahar to get your reaction, maybe from kind of on this report and on this presentation, and then also of course kind of explain a bit about your work in New York and kind of how this relates. Also, I'll be very interested in hearing about that. So please go ahead.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the invitation, and also congratulations on an excellent report, and something that's so important in terms of pieces of documentation to continuously fill those gaps that we know there are. I'll start off just with a quick introduction of Outright and maybe the work that we do specifically focusing on the UN here in New York. So by way of introduction, Outright is a 32-year-old organization that's working to promote and protect the rights of LGBTI persons globally. I would say the majority of our work is actually regionally focused. We have regional teams in the Caribbean and in Sub-Saharan Africa, in the Middle East and Northern Africa, and Asia and Pacific. But we also have two different programs that kind of work in conjunction with those programs that are working directly on the ground with folks and partners doing that work on the national, local, and regional level. And those two programs are our research program and also our UN program. And I sit in the UN program in particular as a program officer. And our UN program, I mean, since the creation of Outright as an organization, we've been, we were originally doing ad hoc work at the UN, so participating in various forums and building coalitions and doing things at the Human Rights Council and so on and so forth. But in 2015, we actually had, a look at strategy and what would help in terms of filling a gap. And we realized, we are based in New York. In 2010, we received ECOSOC accreditation. And when we received that accreditation, we were one of, I think, 5 LGBTI organizations globally that had ECOSOC accreditation. And we were and continue to be the only LGBTI-led organization in the US that has ECOSOC accreditation. So we took that, privilege quite seriously and decided, in 2015, we have amazing colleagues like Ilga World in Geneva and able to, have a regular appearance and work with the bodies and member states there. We said, okay, we're in New York, so we have to work in conjunction with that work that's being done and regularly monitor what's happening in New York and transmit that information from New York globally. So activists and policymakers know what's happening in New York. So we focus particularly for the past 7 years now on the mechanisms here in New York. And what does that look like is, following the General Assembly that takes place from September, or at least the third committee from September to December, focusing on the third committee, which focuses on human rights and humanitarian work. We also engage at the Commission on the Status of Women, taking place in March every year, as well as the high-level political forum on the Sustainable Development Goals, taking place in July every year. Outside of those forums, we also work following the Security Council, particularly as one of 19 members of the NGO Working Group on Women, Peace, and Security, queering that lens and bringing visibility to the impact of conflict on LGBTI people. And then we're also, we have the privilege of being one of the founding members of the current secretariat of an informal group of states called the UN LGBTI Core Group, which is an informal group of now 39 states working specifically focusing on the UN in New York. And we work with these member states, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and Outright is one of 2 NGOs in the group, along with Human Rights Watch. And what we're doing is trying to have regular engagement in various spaces at the UN to bring visibility to the experiences of LGBTI individuals. I've been with Outright for 5 years. So, I've been taking kind of stock now of what I've seen in the past 5 years. And, Mira, you were talking about it in the report, there's this long history of engagement of LGBTI people with UN mechanisms dating back all the way from Tunin, which was the first decriminalization case ever to take place. And it has a lasting impact, as we've seen in multiple cases, even in recent history, right? But all the way from Tunin to recent history, there's been quite a bit of engagement, and for various reasons, there might be, those might be the only resorts and methods of resorts for activists to be able to find change, because either they have limited access to or are completely shut out of legal bodies within their national or regional contexts. So it's been quite an important space for LGBTI activism and the recognition of our experiences. And in the past 5 years, taking stock of what we've seen is this increased visibility, I will say, and increased engagement with these issues. So we see an increase in visibility through various events that have taken place and regular events that we're now seeing taking place in various contexts. We see more statements being made. So the report does recognize a number of these initial statements that took place, right? And I would say there were very important in the aspect of that they came few and far between. And when they did take place, it was a big event. And now I think it's an interesting development to note that they're so regular that I'm not sure they still have that, monumentous impact, or they do have an impact, but monumentous noteworthiness when they take place because they're so regular. And I think that's a great development, right? That there's more and more of that conversation taking place, so that now it's just, within the norm of the conversation, or increasingly getting there, right? We've also seen, at least when it comes to the core group, this increase in membership. I can even say from 5 years ago, I believe we're 24 members, and now we are 39 and continue to grow. And we've also seen an increase in votes on resolutions that include references to SOGI in particular. I think we were talking about how the extrajudicial executions resolution, for a long time, at least in New York, was the only resolution to include explicit mention to sexual orientation and gender identity. We still do not have any references to gender expression or sex characteristics. But I can say that, the votes in support of that resolution, and particularly in maintaining that paragraph, has increased, even though we still see a vote on that paragraph to try to remove it. And previously, the what we call the EJE resolution, or the extrajudicial executions resolution, was the only resolution. But as of last year, we've actually been able to achieve a second ever resolution on democracy and elections, which I think is quite an achievement, given that resolution for quite some time, it was with sexual orientation was adopted in 2000, gender identity was only added in 2010. So there's quite a bit of time in between. And now we have a resolution quickly adding both of them, right? Which was quite an achievement. And we're also seeing more and more coming from UN agencies and the SecGen's office. We're seeing reporting that includes the experiences of LGBTI individuals or mentions of LGBTI individuals. And we know that more so now than ever, that LGBTI activists are working directly with these country offices or regional offices to make sure to highlight those experiences and have the access to the resources that are available through UN agencies and entities. But the findings of this report, I think, are emblematic of the issues facing LGBTI communities, but more specifically trans and intersex communities worldwide, and shows the limitations on the discussions at the UN when it comes to these rights, both externally and internally, of course. I'd say that the depth of the discussion is quite limited, and historically has been quite limited. It's often not bringing an intersectional lens to how LGBTI individuals are not living single issue lives, nor is any person living a single issue life, right? We've seen historically an overemphasis on physical violence, and neglecting the way in which economic and social violence has an immense impact on the lives of people and puts LGBTI people at risk. And of course, we also see this tendency to focus on issues facing LGBT communities over trans and intersex communities, right? Not having that language still to be able to differentiate this acronym that we're so quickly tending to use, and understand that there's various, individuals based off of these various identities are facing different extremes of violence and discrimination. We need to be able to recognize that and really break that down. So what Outright has been trying to do is to combat this by working within the UN LGBTI core group as a secretariat to break down this siloing of issues, or this very, surface level discussion around LGBTI rights. We don't want to just throw in SOGI now without having a more in-depth conversation. So we try to push a more intersectional framework. And you can see this when it comes to some of the events that are taking place. The core group holds 2 annual events, one during High Level Week for the General Assembly that takes place usually the end of September, as well as to recognize the International Day Against Homophobia, Biphobia, Transphobia, and Intersex Phobia in May. And what we try to do with those events is really try to go a bit deeper. We're talking about violence and discrimination, but the multifaceted ways that individuals face that, also based on the other identities that they hold, right? And in the context that they're coming from. And we also do this in the statements. I know originally we had done, I think in 5 years ago, at least from my history with Outright and within the core group, I recognize that we did originally maybe 3 statements a year. And that would be at the 3rd committee, at the Commission on the Status of Women and the High Level Political Forum. And now this past year alone, we've done 10 statements in various forums, including on Indigenous issues, on climate, on issues facing people with disabilities, to kind of break down that siloing, to say that we can't just talk about LGBTI issues in what's understood as a comfortable forum or a comfortable area of understanding, right? We need to break it down and understand again that people live these lives that are multifaceted, and we need to understand that to be able to get to the crux of the issue and the experiences that they're facing. And we also work with a cross-cutting group of civil society to enhance this messaging, particularly when it comes to language suggestions in different UN forums and conferences and the outcome documents of those forums. But, you know, just to kind of end here, you know, a lot more work needs to be done overall, as this isn't an issue specific to LGBTI communities, but all peoples and states and bodies continue to, as states and bodies continue to oversimplify issue areas and continue to work within this traditional approach of how to address human rights and when it's appropriate to bring in a human rights framework. So what we're trying to, you know, there definitely needs to be a lot more work done to kind of break down this traditional approach and understand that human rights has to be integrated in all spaces. And, you know, I think this report goes a long way to continue to do that, right? To break down these silos and open up that door to understand, you know, that these aren't just things that we're talking about theoretically, but they're actually the lived experiences of individuals who are even working in these spaces to make these events or statements possible. But I'll stop there, and thank you so much again for, you know, inviting Outright and giving us the space to kind of react to this really important piece of documentation.
Great, thank you so much. I don't know, Mira, did you have anything to kind of to say based on what Sahar said, or should we? There's a question also in the chat that I can go to. Yeah, okay. There's a question on how to, you know, participate in this work, I guess, with specifically within the civil society, if someone is interested in joining. So I'm assuming that this is more about perhaps, you know, you mentioned, Sahar, that not only do you kind of have these more local offices that kind of work on local issues within Outright, but then you are also part of these civil society organization coalitions within the UN work. So maybe something based on this question is, how does this work from a perspective of bringing voices maybe from the global south, you know, from countries where you know, the experience of living as a trans, non-binary, and gender diverse person is let's say much more marginalized and threatened than maybe in places like Geneva and New York, let's say. So I think, you know, kind of how do you bring in these voices as someone who works also in Geneva and is interested in the procedural aspects of trying to kind of do this similar work? Maybe we can kind of use this question to talk about this a bit.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So here at Outright, and particularly our UN program, we work, as I said, very closely with our regional programs to speak directly and hear directly from local partners on the ground to get their experiences, and when possible, to bring those voices directly into these spaces, right? So events that take place, we're constantly looking at opportunities to elevate and bring a visibility to those voices. But we also have in our UN program particular programs and opportunities that happen throughout the year in the form of fellowship opportunities. So we have currently what's called the UN Religion Fellowship at Outright, and this fellowship is focusing on bringing voices from the global south and east into the UN spaces to particularly combat this false narrative around a dichotomy between religion and LGBTI people and their lives, right? So usually this program focuses on working with LGBTI people of faith and bringing those voices, building the capacity around these forums, giving that background on what is CSW or what is the HLPF and what are the entry points in those forums. And then, having folks just engage in those spaces when we see opportunities for either speaking in official sessions or informal sessions or on events that are focusing on these forums, to be able to elevate those voices. But really what we try to do in our program is just to kind of open up that space, use our ECOSOC accreditation to open up that door and have people speak for themselves. We are not representing LGBTI individuals, but rather we're working with LGBTI individuals across the globe to open up that door, to have them, speak their truth in those spaces, to be able to open up those doors and open up those conversations. So those are a couple of ways. We also have annually, well, before COVID and hopefully soon, once again, we had what's called our flagship program, which was called our annual week of UN advocacy, or Advocacy Week, where we would, put out an application process and bring around 40 activists from around the globe to New York and engage in training, and then set up meetings for a week-long set of meetings that were with member states, that were with these specific groupings, with UN agencies and entities, and have them, just really hear from folks on the ground, and have those activists and representatives be able to tell again where they're coming from, what their context looks like, and what the UN should and could be doing in those contexts. So that's a couple of ways in which we've tried at Outright to really elevate those voices and work directly with individuals to open up those spaces.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, I find it personally that, let's say, especially representatives of member states need to be confronted with lived reality, and with people who come to tell their stories, in particularly, as this organization tends to kind of isolate itself as such a giant system. It often forgets, who it is supposed to represent, and we hope that it is the people rather than the member states' interests. At least this is what we're working for. So I don't see another question, so maybe I can ask Mira, speaking about structural and systemic issues. I think there's the findings in the report, I think, clearly show, and as well also our experience of trying to talk to people within the UN system, that it is a very systemic, problem of underrepresentation, inability to understand the issues, but also the way that the system is set up, through the bureaucratic and the IT systems and etc. So I guess, my question is essentially, what is really the most effective way for, people to take forward this knowledge, this report, right, to try to start chipping away at this, seemingly giant and insurmountable task of trying to reform this system, right? Whether you're kind of located on the inside, working within a UN agency, or, perhaps like us, trying to shine a spotlight on these issues. You've mentioned, of course, there's recommendations out there, right? There's, training and education. But maybe, do we take some issue and put it forward and then try to campaign on that within the UN system, or is it more of a broader approach? What do you think really would work as a way to kind of take this forward, for later for later work? So please tell me how to do my job. Essentially, is that what I'm saying?
That's a very good question, and yeah, almost impossible to answer as well, I would say. But yeah, I think there's really a range of kind of starting points to take, I think, and yeah, both from kind of top down as well as bottom up. I think it's very important to realize, I think what you also said, Sahar, that it's about people's actual lived experiences, and that the issues I highlighted, for instance, are hurting people on a daily basis and also creating negative experiences in the workplace on a daily basis. So I think realizing that and being aware of that already is a huge step, I think, because there's still a lot of missing awareness of that. And that already would be a huge step in some ways, of course. But then on a very different level, I think it's also UN reform is one of the trickiest things, I would say, in the international system. And it's almost, well, I don't want to say impossible, but it's very, very hard. And of course, for a number of reasons that I very quickly touch upon in the end of the report, looking at funding gaps, looking at also just the politicization of issues and of reform in itself. So we know already also that a range of states are part of the anti-gender movement and are opposed to SOGIESC rights. So that also, of course, will hinder reform that is focused on internal reform for greater inclusion of all people, regardless of their, for instance, gender identity and expression. But those are things that are very hard to change. But at the same time I think that's another way in, perhaps, to really create stronger alliances between states and also international organizations, between UN bodies, between NGOs that are in favor of SOGIESC rights, that are advocating for SOGIESC rights, to create an equally strong alliance, as we unfortunately have the anti-gender movement. They are a very strong united front, and it's because of that they have so much success. So I think one of the biggest, most important ways to move forward is really to create an equally strong alliance and to not get caught up too much on internal disagreements. I think that's something, of course, I mean, it's very understandable that there are internal disagreements, but it really hinders progress and a united front in the same way that it exists from opponents. So I think being part of that and being part of creating that kind of unity would be very important. And through that, I think we can achieve some change, and we can convince people that these are really issues that are important, not only for people who work in the LGBT team, for instance, at the Human Rights Council, but also for other people who maybe want to work at the UN and are queer or are gender diverse and work on very different topical issues, but they perhaps either don't have access to working in those spaces because of the way they express their gender, because of perhaps their passport not aligning with their name or gender expression, or also just, of course, we also know those issues, I think, very well, that the UN remains also a space that is open largely to privileged people with a lot of education, with funding from families also. For instance, when we're looking at the internship structure, that also is still a huge issue. And there have been some changes. There is one internship a year offered, for instance, at the OHCHR, focused on LGBTQIA+ people, which of course is great, but that's one per year. That's not going to really revolutionize the representation of SOGIESC people within the UN. And so I think increasing access also, and perhaps looking at experience instead of diplomas for some of the positions might also be a way forward to really change this structure of privilege that exists still. So that are some of the things that were mentioned also in interviews with people, and I think that are in some ways achievable and also in other ways very important. Yeah.
Thanks. Yes, definitely. Thanks a lot for this. There's a lot to take in basically, and to try to then to work on. So we don't have a lot of time, but we do have 2 questions. So maybe I will just ask if either of you would like to make a comment on this question around good practices in terms of training. If you know some good practices, you know, I'm assuming this is on LGBTQIA issues within the UN system, and also a comment on the Church of Prismatic Light, which is I guess a new religious organization in America looking to work on this issue that I have not personally heard of, seemingly as a response to the quite severe anti-trans movement that has been ongoing in the US for the last few years. So maybe if either of you would like to comment very briefly for a minute or 2, and then we'll close.
I can jump in, and interestingly enough, I have not heard of this new religion as well, and I'm situated in the US, right? And Outright doesn't have a program focusing specifically on the US. But what I can say, at least through the limited engagement that we have, and also my personal opinion, is that, you know, I think it's important to note that these anti-trans bills and these bills widely seen from anti-gender movements that you were talking about, Mira, are you know, these, you know, we don't want to misunderstand them for what they are and aren't, right? These are bills and these are initiatives to uphold systems of oppression that affect all individuals, including individuals of faith. They are tactics used to try to uphold some quote unquote traditional systems that were put into place to ensure that specific bodies of individuals held on to power and continue to hold that power and use it for their benefit. So when we talk about these bills, I think it's always important to situate them in this wider context, right, of what they're trying to do, the intentions behind them, and how they're just trying to control individuals and take advantage of individuals, including those that maybe think they support them, right? Because it's taking advantage of their fears and these issues around, you know, of change and very, you know, real human reactions to change and what can happen to individuals if they are one, left behind or not understood. So I think it's important to, you know, understand those bills to be terrible and really having a real impact, particularly on trans people, as we see increasing violence and hate speech and hate happening across the US, but globally, right? They're part of a fuller system that is being taken by these anti-gender actors, as you said, that are united, that are working quite diligently and have quite a bit of resources to be able to do this on various contexts. So I think situating it in this more alarming context of how it does not just affect trans individuals, even though it overwhelmingly does, but affects all of us, and really is a call for all individuals to understand it in that light and to push back against them whenever possible, just to realize how they have a very real effect on all of our rights.
All right. So then, Mira, if you're okay with, yeah. So great. So then I think we'll finish here. Thank you both so much for participating. It's been very, you know, as always with these things, it's very encouraging to hear kind of the progress that's being made, and daunting to look at still how much progress we need to be making, but it is always very motivating, right? And maybe from my also side, I would like to thank Jan Hakam, who is working behind the scenes, our communications manager, who also helped us work on the report, and Marcos Castro, who helped with the design. And finally, also to mention that this, as I kind of said at the beginning, this is our first webinar in this series of kind of showing the work of the Rosa-Luxemburg Foundation. And a next one, we do not have a date yet, but it will be soon. So keep an eye out. We have a newsletter on our website, and I believe Outright International also has a newsletter. So please feel free to sign up. And Mira's work also you can follow on Transves and at OHCHR. So with that, then thank you all very much, and thank you to the audience for your questions and for your for listening to us. And that is it. We can stop the recording, I believe.